chapter 1 and then Colossians chapter 1. John chapter 1, we'll begin reading in verse number 1, read a few there, and then skip over to Colossians chapter 1 and read beginning in verse number 16. And so I hope that you can see this okay. It looks pretty good from where I'm standing, just with the minimal amount of lights off, so that you can hopefully, as I said before, stay awake and take a few notes if you would like. So let's stand together, please, if you found John chapter 1 and verse 1, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made." That's a very all-encompassing statement. Everything that is was made by God. And then Colossians chapter 1 and verse 16, where it says, "For by Him," well, let's back up a verse. Verse 15, "Who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. For by Him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and" what? Invisible. Now, think about how great the Bible is. 2,000 years ago, who knew there was anything that was invisible, that would be creatable or created? But yet there it is. A lot of things that now are visible to us were not visible then, through power of a microscope, for example, or a telescope. And of course, some things are not visible in this realm. Angelic beings and spirit beings and so on, the devil, they're not usually visible to us. Heaven's not physically visible to us right now anyway. It will be someday. But it says visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by Him and for Him. And He is before all things, and by Him all things consist. Just sitting here mulling over what I just said, the invisible would also be logic. It's invisible. The laws of creation are, for the most part, you can't see gravity. You can see it work. Emotion, not visible. Intellect, visible. No, not visible. So if you have intellect, you can't physically see it. Emotion, you can't physically see it. And so God invented both the visible and the invisible. Now, tonight we're going to focus on this idea of biological evolution. And what does that mean exactly? And we'll go from there. And I've got some challenges for the theory. And a lot of this, a few of you have heard a series a few years ago, I guess 5 or 6, 7 years ago. I went through some of this on Sunday morning. A lot of what you'll hear tonight I did not share then. Some of that I did share. And I hope we get through it all. I've got a lot to cover. So I better quit yakking and we'll pray and you can be seated. Father, we thank you. We love you. We ask for your blessing. We ask for your help. We ask you please to touch our lives and give us what we need tonight to be who we ought to be for you. And Lord, we just thank you for the truth of the Word of God, for the power of its Word, and just that it changes our hearts every time we touch it. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. You may be seated. Once again, all things were made by Him. And without Him was not anything made that was made. Again, Colossians 1:16, "For by Him were all things created." That means to make ex nihilo, from nothing, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by Him, and for that matter, for Him. And by the way, Revelation tells us that creation was made for His pleasure. He gets something out of it. He enjoys His creation. Now, we're going to challenge the theory of evolution in many ways, and we're going to contend that that the evidence is not sufficient that we should consider it a viable idea. I like what this guy says. You know, sometimes these guys are brutally honest. He says evolution is unproved and unprovable. We believe it only because the alternative, special creation, and that It is special creation, and that is unthinkable. In other words, if we don't believe in evolution, we have to conclude that there's a God who created everything, and that idea is unbearable to us. Now, the first thing we're going to use to challenge the theory of evolution are the limits of what is called natural selection. Now this, I'm going to try not to get in the weeds here, but I've got to walk you through just a couple things about this. Natural selection is the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. We oftentimes say it like this, that we believe in the survival of the fittest. Now that is not exactly the phrase that many evolutionists would like us to use. In fact, it's not the phrase that I would like to use either, probably. It may be survival of the luckiest in many cases. You know, if you step on a trail of ants, they all are the same. Some get stepped on and some don't. That's survival of the luckiest. None of them can breed resistance to a shoe put on top of them. So no matter how much they change, they can't change enough to survive. And so the first thing, though, about natural selection is that it is a selective process. Now, here's what I mean. I'll illustrate just a moment, but some birds have long beaks, some have short beaks. You know, when Darwin went around and his sailing trip, and he was a naturalist, an untrained naturalist, just sort of a philosopher-type guy. He trained to be a preacher, then he backed out on that when he began to think about creation or evolution and so on. But he noticed some little birds on a couple of islands that are called finches. And he noticed that some of the finches had different beaks than some of the other finches. Some had long, strong beaks. Some had skinny, short, thin, thick, a lot of differences. And he concluded that it was based on the kind of food that they consumed, that they would need different types of beaks to eat different types of food. And he said, so it must just be that some of the finches maybe didn't survive because their beaks were not strong enough to crack the nuts. Others did. They survived. Because they survived, they had more babies. And so in that place, the population with those kind of beaks grew, and the other kind of beaks shrank because they had a hard time surviving. Now, we actually see that. We believe that. That's observable. For example, there's 1 million kinds of dogs in the world, right? And a lot of that is due to human interference. I mean, you don't find pocket poodles in nature, and you don't find Great Danes in nature. You don't find dachshunds like my little Sterling in the natural world. In fact, there are some days I wish he didn't exist in any world. But my wife, while I was gone, had quite a time with him keeping up with his little gifts all over the house. But anyway, he's got a lifespan just like all of us, and there'll come a day when we'll have a funeral, hallelujah. But there's lots of kind of dogs. Now, if they were just in nature, just running around breeding and interbreeding, then you would never find these highly specified breeds like we see. There's a lot of human interference that causes that. However, God did give every creature variety in its genetics. And that was so it could survive in an ever-changing world. Because sometimes there's lots of food, sometimes there's not. Sometimes there's one predator, sometimes another predator. And so an animal this year that might do well because it's black versus white, like let's say a bug that's green versus brown. Well, the green bug may be very popular with the birds. And so the brown bugs would survive, and they would pass on their brown color probably to their descendants. We know that happens. I had genetics. I understand how it works. And it's a wonderful thing that God put into his creation. So there's variation. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but basically this, natural selection does occur. It's a process that God put in to keep species, to keep animals alive. And so some of the changing back and forth with the genetics can actually cause animals to become extinct, though. For example, if you have the brown beetles that become the only beetles after many generations, and then all of a sudden there's a new predator that comes on into the area that loves brown beetles, all of those get eaten up, and they can't go back to being green. They've lost the genes that made them green because they get bred out. And of course, that would be a loss of information, which is not evolution. For evolution to occur, there has to be a gain of information. For example, you hear about, they say, well, what about the fish that live in caves underwater and they've lost the ability to see? Their eyes no longer function. Okay, that happens. However, that is a loss of information. That is the opposite of evolution. That is a downward trend. They're losing their genetic code. It's been bred out because the recessive genes become so recessive they'll never surface again. I mean, they don't literally disappear, but they'll never appear again in a visible form because they're like hyper recessive, I'll put it that way. And so they'll never be seen again. They can't be regained. So they've lost that, but that is a loss of information. Just like they used to say, and they've quit saying this, they used to say that the human body had a lot of what is called vestigial organs, things that were left over from evolution, like our coccyx, they said, was left over from a tail, and that our appendix was vestigial, had no function. That they one time said there's about 200 different parts of the human body that they once said were left over from evolution. Now there's a zero list. We now know that every part of the human body has function. And so if you don't believe your tailbone, your coccyx has function, then let's just take it out and see how you do. It has a lot of function. And one of the benefits is too gross to mention, but it's there. And if Charles Darwin, Richard Dawkins rather, and some of these guys would like to demonstrate, I would chip in to have theirs taken out. But anyway, so animals do have variety, and sometimes one variety will survive better than another. But then maybe there's a change, and then that variety doesn't survive so well. So anyway, let's just get in here. I hope you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, it might explain, natural selection might explain the survival of the fittest, as we say, why certain traits benefit creatures more in certain environments, but it does not explain the arrival of the fittest, where the genes and the creatures came from in the first place. That is one of the limits of natural selection. It can tell you, or it can predict, or not predict is not the right word, but it can reveal itself in that maybe the green bug does better because the brown bug is eaten more. But it can't tell you where the green bug came from. And it can't tell you where the green versus the brown versus red versus black came from. So it is a selective process. It is something that already is there in the gene pool that is being, by circumstances, being made more prominent because of the way genetics works. And it says here, the death of individuals not adapted to an environment and the survival of those that are suited does not explain the origin of the traits. In other words, where did the green color come from to start with? How did the green gene get in the DNA of the bug? How did the red gene get there to start with? There may be 20 colors that are available, but they're already there. Natural selection does not produce anything. It is not a creative process. Now, it does not explain the origin of the traits that make an organism better adapted to an environment. In other words, I mentioned the finches. We observe the different beak lengths and different thicknesses, but it does not explain the origin of beaks, for example, or the birds themselves, where they came from. So there's a lot of limits on that. And I've noticed this, and I can already tell I'm not going to get finished. I've noticed this. Read evolutionary literature, and you'll see something that'll really, you won't see it at first. They assign intelligence to natural selection. They assign the qualities of intelligent design to a inert, dead process, if you want to call it that. They will say things like, evolution demanded. Well, now, wait a minute. Evolution is not a living, thinking thing. It doesn't demand anything. They'll say natural selection chose. Oh, wait, whoa. Natural selection is not a living thing. It doesn't choose. See, it is a result, not a cause. Does that make sense? So that's why I'm saying the limits of natural selection are quite strong, and it is not a creative process. It doesn't create anything. It just reveals the result of sort of a thinning out based on which attributes allow something to be more healthy and live better and longer and produce more offspring. It in no way explains what I call the goo to you, the puddle to people, or mud to man evolution. The short answer is, of course, it doesn't. Now, here are our bugs. Neither does it explain how you can go from a beetle to a boy, which, by the way, is what they tell us. That everything that's alive has a common ancestor that was a single-celled living thing. And if you go back far enough, there's a single cell that they would point to and say, all life came from that one single cell. That you and your great, a million times great-grandfather was an E. coli, or something of that nature. A single-celled organism. Now, it cut off part of my, I've kind of explained this already, so let me just fly through this. Like I say, I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit. Here's an interesting thing. Now, when I was at Georgia, we studied cloning. And this is from 1980s. And they were cloning trees for forestry purposes. And they thought, man, what a great thing it would be if we were to find the very best tree, the very best tree in our orchard, so to speak, maybe a pine tree. Find the very best tree, and we genetically copy that tree and make a whole forest of perfect trees. And you know what? They did that. And they found out that was a mistake. You know why? Because one bug that comes along could kill all of them, because they are all susceptible to the same insects or the same diseases. And while they still do it some, it is much more risky in one sense that they have to apply more herbicides or pesticides and fungicides and all these kind of sides to keep these trees alive. Why? Because one bug, the wrong bug, can kill every one of them. Whereas in nature, you get the same number of trees. Any one threat will only kill a certain number because God installed variety for the survival of the trees. And so not all of them are going to die. You go to North Georgia and look in the mountains, you see all those trees are dead now. There was some kind of bug that came through a few years ago. But it didn't kill all the trees. It just killed a few of them, some of them, a small portion in fact. And so DNA is responsible for this. And it says here 90% of nursery-grown trees are cloned, and they say the Arbor Day Foundation disease is spreading. But it is spreading like a wildfire through cities with all these cloned trees. So cloning is a bad idea for many reasons. That's another one. God designed variety in His creation to allow adaptation or resistance in some cases just to keep something alive. So natural selection can explain which dish on the buffet was most often selected, but not where the dish came from. You see? It doesn't tell us how the chicken salad came to be. It just tells us that most people like the chicken salad. Natural selection or variations, they're really synonym words and phrases, can result in many varieties of a species, like it is likely that the gray wolf is the ancestor of all modern canines. That means the wolf DNA contains all of these variations within it. And again, a lot of these, in fact, probably all these I'm looking at, are here because they are man-induced breeding changes. In other words, we bred for a certain thing over generations and developed all these different breeds of dogs. But the wolf probably is the ancestor, and within that wolf DNA are all these variations and more variations. God did that to keep the canine kind, K-I-N-D, alive about no matter what happens. Because you can imagine that a small dog like Sterling would require less food than a big dog, like I think Jennifer has labs, Emily and them got labs, big dogs, right? They eat a lot, don't they? They eat like horses. Now Sterling is sort of a blend. He's a small dog that eats a lot. And natural selection cannot result in this. which is, if you go a little further to the left, the puddle to people idea that we evolved from a line of other less complicated animals. Natural selection cannot do this. It can't result in this. Evolutionists are constantly giving us examples of things like dog varieties as evidence of puddle to people evolution. Now, variety, the difference in varieties, and I try to avoid the term, but I'm going to give it to you because you'll hear it, is called microevolution. That's what this, officially the word is, microevolution, where you've got 20 flavors of cats or 20 flavors of dogs or of fish. Micro meaning small, evolution meaning small changes, but I don't like the word because I don't want to give them the word. I don't want to use evolution in reference to anything like that, but that's what one of the terms that's used. Now, so we will give them the idea behind microevolution, but what they do is in the textbooks, they show you examples of microevolution of all these different kinds of dogs, or the fact that you can have a black moth, a white moth, or a red moth, and then they say, see there, that's proof that you came from an amoeba. So hang on a minute. I don't think that's proof of anything like that. I mean, look at all the different people in here. You got tall ones, short ones, skinny ones, other ones, some with hair, some without hair. Now, the other ones, that's not due to your genetics, probably. It's due to fried chicken, but and too much ice cream. But, you know, your bald-headedness may be genetically an issue. And I'm glad my hair is turning gray, not loose. But, hey, at least you got a head to put it on. However, the dozens of varieties of dogs which exist is not evidence that a dog evolved into a non-dog. Microevolution is observable. It is repeatable. That's how they make Chihuahuas. But never do you see a dog become something that's not a dog. I don't care how much you breed it. It has never been observed, ever. Now, oh boy, time. So we're going to challenge it also by the lack of a proven mechanism. In other words, how does evolution happen? There's got to be a cause. If evolution is the effect, what is the cause? Well, the evolutionists suggest basically two ideas. One is mutation, and the other is genetic recombination. They say those are the driving forces. I read it again today. Those are the driving forces of evolution. So what is mutation? That's an accident or a copying mistake in your DNA, in your genes. What is a genetic recombination? Well, it's sort of like just taking an alphabet and just rearranging the letters. That's what it really boils down to. So two things on this and then some more on this. Mutations are almost always immediately harmful. Now, they're all harmful at some point, but most of them are immediately harmful, and most of them are deadly right away. Number two, genetic recombination cannot account for the addition of new genetic information needed for a single-cell organism to evolve into a human being. I'll expound on that in just a moment. Let me illustrate. For example, here's a graphic showing sort of what happens when a mutation occurs. You've got, you know, a normal strand of DNA, and then maybe UV light comes in and hits it, and it breaks these two, to say it in a simple way. It causes a damage here. So then, if there's a birth that carries these into it, you'll have a problem with whatever is born because of this mutation. And again, it is almost always immediately harmful. There's a lot of different examples of this. For example, goodness, and I'm sorry, we cut off the top of that. We'll have to fix that for next time. But mutations are often associated with diseases or defects. Harmful results of mutations in humans include certain types of cancer, hemophilia, albinism, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, and many other things. It can happen, it can make things like a wingless beetle or a wingless fly. And you know, you'll read, these guys they really reach out there to find some good beneficial mutation. I read one account that says, see there, mutations are good because there's a fly that lives on an island that's really windy, and since they can't fly and get blown away, they do better than those that can fly. Yeah, but they also starve because they can't fly. Or a hairless dog. Now, hairless dogs, first of all, they're gross. Amen? I mean, a hairless dog is sick looking. Would you want to have a hair? Does anybody have a hairless dog? Are you in the market for a hairless dog? I don't think you are. I don't think hairless dogs are going to be very popular. Neither will they survive in cold weather. So it's eventually maybe fatal. Now, evolutionists believe that mutations can gradually change an organism from one kind to another as natural selection favors the mutations that are beneficial. Now, again, here's some examples of mutations that are harmful. But even if mutations were always beneficial, it does not create information. Mutations change information. They do not create new information. And to have evolution, you have to have new information. I'll talk in just a moment about the size and the number of genes in a single-celled organism versus you. You have, I'll give you, I bet you'd guess, you have more genes than an E. coli does. Well, where did all that information come from? Because genetics, DNA, as we saw before, is information. It is a language with an alphabet that makes you who you are. I mean, your skin color, for example. We're over in the Philippines. Everybody there has brown skin, brown eyes, and black hair. And they're about this tall. If somebody's this tall, they're big. And hardly anybody's fat. But they all have diabetes, and they're all dying young because they eat too much rice. Now, how could such errors, that's what a mutation is, create 3 billion letters of DNA that is required to take a microbe and change it into a microbiologist? Well, it didn't happen. Here's a lady, she's pretty smart. She has a PhD in molecular genetics from not a Bible college, but Ohio State. And she formerly served as an assistant and associate professor in biology at Mount Vernon Nazarene University. She is a Christian, but she was trained in a secular college. And she says, and it's a fact, we are still waiting to hear of a satisfactory example of a beneficial mutation. Now, if you read your science textbook, it'll say something else. The scientists all know better. They're still waiting for the first example of a good mutation. And this is a recent picture of her, by the way. I just heard her speak on video about 2 weeks ago. And of course, she also makes the point that mutations do not add information. They merely corrupt it or change it in some way. It's like this. You got 52 cards in a deck, right? Normal playing cards, you got 52 cards. Given enough time to shuffle the deck, could you ever end up with 53 cards? If you shuffle it a million times for a million years, would you somehow come out with an extra card? So shuffling DNA does not create more DNA. You still just have the same number of genes, you see. Genetic recombination or arranging genetic information in a different order does not explain how genetic information grew. Now here's what the example. E. coli has about 4,400 genes. It is small and simple compared to you. So it has 4,400 genes. Now, ex-President Bush, former President Bush, and you and I have about 24,000 genes. And about 3 billion with a B base pairs. That's a little more technical term than you need to hear. But so given enough chances to shuffle the genes in the E. coli, if you shuffled it enough for a long period of time, would it somehow end up being 24,000 genes? No, any more than your 52 card deck would end up being 53 or 153 or 1,053. If you only got so many genes, no matter how you arrange them, you still got that number of genes. So evolution cannot hope to explain the addition of new genes to the gene pool. And by the way, I mentioned a few weeks ago all the fatal flaws. There's so many of them. This is one. Because without a way to increase the information in the genetic code, you would still have, if they were right, you would still just have the original single-cell organism, because there's no way it can grow on its own and add extra information to become you. They have no idea how it happens, but they pretend like they do. All right, now here's a little more of a technical term, biochemical pathways, and I'll call them assembly lines within the cell. The fact that there are biochemical pathways, or as we'll call them tonight, assembly lines inside your cells, that in itself is a challenge to evolution. This is an assembly line of old cars way back in the day, and each car passes by a station, and somebody puts on the parts, it keeps rolling, right? In a certain order. I think Andrew used to work at General Motors, worked on the assembly line, I think, at least for a little while, and he would stand there, and maybe he puts on a door, puts on the same door all day long. Door, 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 all day. But you can't put the door on until the door frame is there, right? So it's got to be in a certain order. So that's the way assembly line works. Same thing here. Here's a computer assembly line. Same thing here. Here's a cell phone assembly line. Now, there are assembly lines inside each of your cells, and they make things. They produce products using components and a step-by-step process. They are called biochemical pathways, or some of them might be called metabolic pathways. They produce, in some cases, energy, for example. They take in food and produce energy, and there are components, and it happens in a step-by-step process, much like an assembly line. And by the way, I didn't really make up this idea of it being an assembly line. This is the Department of Biology and Environmental Science. And a quote from their website says, in certain ways, a metabolic pathway is similar to a factory assembly line. Products are assembled from parts by workers. Workers are enzymes who each perform a specific step in the manufacturing process. Enzymes of a cell are like the workers on the assembly line. Each is only responsible for a particular step in the assembly process. So it is much like an assembly line. Now here's your cell phone. Look at all the parts to it. Now each component is a tiny machine in and of itself. Each one of those has a function. They work. However, they have no independent purpose. They only work when they're put in combination with the rest of the phone. Each tiny machine has to be precisely designed and manufactured to do a specific job. Each component must be manufactured so as to fit in the right place. Each component has to be assembled in the right order. All components have to be installed for the cellular phone to work properly. Now, can I suggest to you that no evolutionist would suggest that their cell phone happened by random time and chance? But yet they look at your child and say, your child did. If you were to seriously say, well, this just happened by natural forces, they would lock you up in a loony bin. But then why is it more rational and reasonable to believe that, and by the way, what is more complicated, this dead cell phone or your living body? Yeah, one cell in your body is countless times more complicated than a cell phone. And yet, they suggest that this couldn't happen by random time and chance, but you did. An example of one of these assembly lines is cellular respiration. Your cells have to respire or you don't live. And so you see, I won't go through this in great detail, but there's a process, there's parts, there's production, and there's a product. Same thing about photosynthesis. It is a process with steps in order, with components that has a product. What do we breathe? We breathe what? Air, the primary ingredient of which is oxygen. And what do plants give off? Say again? Oxygen. They take in CO2 and give out oxygen, right? That's why you got to have plants to maintain life on Earth. Now, here's the point. Each of these biochemical pathways is like an assembly line, which produces a product. The product is made by assembling the components of the product step by step in a proper order. Questions. Who designed the assembly process? If you went down to General Motors and they showed you the assembly line and said, look, we just came in one day and there it was. Man, we couldn't believe it. We had an empty warehouse. It'd been sitting idle for 5 million years. Came in and there was that, man, that thing was awesome. And there's cars running down the track, being assembled on their own, spontaneously, by natural forces. Well, again, they'd put you somewhere in a straitjacket. So when you look at a cell and you see these processes, you see these assembly lines, well, the process, the assembly line, somebody had to thunk it up, right? Somebody had to say, we need an assembly line. And so it had to be designed. So who designed it? Who designed the components? Who figured out the order in which the components should be assembled? How did the components become assembled in the right order? The components have no independent purpose. In other words, they have no purpose except as being part of the whole. The parts were designed to participate and cooperate in making the final function. Well, I'm going to suggest to you if there's participation, there has to be intelligence. What are we participating in without intelligence? If there's cooperation, there has to be intelligence behind it all. Thus, the parts would not exist were the final product not already in mind, not already designed. So how could such a process evolve? How could this assembly line be designed without a designer? Invented without an inventor? Organized without an organizer? Built without a builder, should have been capital B. Assembled without any assemblers? How did non-living enzymes decide to participate and decide to cooperate one with the other? Guess what? They don't. They can't. They're not alive. They don't think. Do non-living things have a plan? Do they make a plan? No, they're not alive. They don't think. They don't plan. They don't know. And again, when you read literature, and I've read so much of it, I'm sick of it, my brain hurts. If you read literature promoting evolution, they will assign the traits of intelligence to it. It doesn't think, it doesn't plan, it doesn't know, it doesn't demand, but yet you will read statements that imply that it does. They really assign the qualities of God to what they claim is a natural process. Natural as in no God. I forgot this one. Do non-living things anticipate the needs of an organism? And by the way, do dead animals plan for the future? In other words, do all the green bugs that got eaten after they're dead, do they get together and say, you know, we should have been brown? Next time we'll be brown. Hey, you guys, be brown next time. Does that happen? No, that doesn't happen. But they almost imply that somehow that's the way this works, that the dead ones are unhappy that they're dead, so they somehow go, and they create green. Is it reasonable to believe these highly specialized processes, and I stress that word because there's many steps, and products came to exist by random time and chance? Certainly not. Nope. Now, they sort of know this. Here's Franklin Harold, who is a noted evolutionary biochemist. He said, we got to concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations. In other words, they have no idea how these little assembly lines came to be. But do you read that in your science textbook? No. Somehow they skipped it. The challenge from the obvious evidence of an intelligent designer should have had caps. For the visible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. In other words, it's pretty obvious that the art proves the existence of the artist. No one would look at the Mona Lisa and say, guess what? That just happened on its own with no artist. The building proves the builder exists. That's a cool building too, by the way. I mean, could anybody in their right mind look at that and say, was there a builder? Nah, I doubt it. It just happened. The invention is proof the inventor exists, and the creation proves the creator exists. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Nobody is born an atheist. They have to be talked into it. Living things look like they were designed. So how do evolutionists know they were not designed? Here's our friend Richard Dawkins. He doesn't debate anymore, by the way. He got his clock cleaned a few times by some creationists, and he quit debating. But he still blabs all over the planet. He said, biology is the study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed with a purpose. Well, Ricky, I don't know. In other words, he's saying, don't believe your lying eyes now. Just because it looks designed doesn't mean it is. And I'm saying, Ricky, maybe things appear to be designed because they were designed. See, they have to deny the obvious. They have to deny, and by the way, they wouldn't say that about anything else. It's like when I talked about the day-age theory last time, and I said only in Genesis does anybody question what a day is. No other place in the Bible does anybody say, is a day a day? No, it's obvious. So why here, and why on this subject alone, do we say that this pulpit of wood wasn't made? Nobody made that. That clavinova, nobody made that. We don't say stuff like that. Why? Because it's lunacy, that's why. But somehow, when it comes to living things, some people think it's intelligent to question whether or not there was a creator. Now, remember Francis Crick, co-founder or co-discoverer rather of the double helix, said, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Why does he say that? Because everything that is screams, somebody made me. And to not believe that, you have to constantly talk yourself out of believing it. It's just way too obvious that that's what happened. Now, the problem for evolutionists is that living things show too much design. I mean, nobody objects when an archaeologist says that pottery points to human design, right? You don't find a pot, a 1,000-year-old pot. We saw some in the Philippine Museum last year. They've got all these 2,000-year-old pots laying around in there. Nobody says, wow, look at there what nature did. No, you say somebody had to make that. Yet if someone attributes the design in living things to a designer, it cannot be deemed logical by the evolutionist. The evolutionist tells us that the tricycle had a designer. You know, I bought a little tricycle for Mason when he was about a week old. And didn't want to get left. I didn't want to wait till the last minute, so I went ahead and bought him one. Got him a red tricycle. So that they say the tricycle had a designer, but the little tyke riding it didn't. That's what they want you to believe. They claim the simple was not designed. Is a tricycle simple? Sure. But the complex, the person, the little boy, the tyke, who was complex, was not designed. Is that logical? Certainly not. I like what Reagan said. He says, sometimes when I'm faced with an atheist, I'm tempted to invite him to the greatest gourmet dinner that one could ever serve. And when he had finished eating that magnificent dinner, to ask him if he believes there's a cook. I like Reagan. I hope he's in heaven. Is there a cook, he says. All right, so how did complex or multicellular life evolve from unicellular or single-celled organisms? How did cells adapted to individual survival learn, quote unquote, to cooperate and specialize, undergoing programmed cell death to create complex plants and animals? By the way, let me throw this in there real quick. You remember when we started this and I said I'm going to give you 15 questions I hope you want to ask? All these 15 are amongst what I've showed you either this time or time before. I just decided to bring it a little different way because I'd be doing that for weeks and weeks. So I'm just giving you a shorter version of some of these questions. I'm covering all the 15. I just didn't lay that out like I first thought I would because it would take way, way too long. So the question is, how did life go from one cell to something that has a lot of cells? And why? Why would this decide to become that? I mean, if this was alive and doing just fine, why would it decide that, wait a minute, it wouldn't decide that because it didn't know what that was. It didn't decide that because it doesn't decide anything. So that just couldn't happen on its own, you see. How and why did sexual reproduction originate? There's a lot of things in nature that they don't have a male and female. They're asexual. Asexual reproduction gives up to twice as much reproductive success as compared to sexual reproduction. Yet only a small minority of living things reproduce asexually. So the logic there is, now wait a minute, since asexual came first, according to evolutionists, and it's much more efficient than male and female way, the sexual way, why would that happen? Well, by their way of thinking, it shouldn't, right? Because it would make it, I mean, the more babies you have, right, the more likely you are to survive. Well, in asexual reproduction, you don't really have babies per se, but you have another one. They just divide. That cell division just happens without any fertilization. So if that was already going so well, and it works much better, much more efficiently than sexual reproduction, which a lot of them die and don't live long, then how would that happen to begin with? Well, by their way of thinking, it should not happen. And we know it happens because God made each of them the way they are. Living things using asexual reproduction would thus be more fit to survive, you see, because they reproduce almost at will with they don't have to get married first, you see. And so why would sexual reproduction evolve at all? By their way of thinking, why would sexual reproduction evolve at all when it makes an organism less likely to survive? I mean, you ever seen the movies where they got the Amazon women and that's all they got is ladies? Well, eventually they're all going to die, right? Because they can't just split and produce new ladies. So sexual reproduction is less efficient and produces less people or less items than asexual would if we did it that way. You'd never run out of folks, but if you have to have a male and a female, and you don't have the males or the females, your time is limited. So why would that happen at all? It would not happen, according to the way they believe. And for that matter, how could mere physics and chemistry invent the complementary apparatuses needed for sexual reproduction simultaneously? How could random time and chances produce a male and a female at the same time when it didn't know what that was? It never existed. It wouldn't. It couldn't. Non-intelligent processes cannot plan for future coordination of male and female parts. Now, here's an interesting one. Challenges from the fossil record. What is the fossil record? I'll say it like this. It is the evidence of all known fossils taken as a whole. That is the fossil record, the evidence of all known fossils taken as a whole. In other words, when you look at all the fossils that we have, and we say, what do they tell us? That's the fossil record, okay? Now, Genesis 7:19, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. Global flood and almost global sedimentary rock. I believe it's 66% of the planet's covered with sedimentary rock, and that's where the fossils are. Sedimentary rock forms in water, fossils form in sedimentary sediments, in mud, becomes rock later, and that's where all the fossils are. Now, there's something called a transitional fossil. In his book on the origin of species, Charles Darwin devoted 2 chapters to one of his most vexing concerns, and that was gaps in the fossil record. From Darwin's day to present, the completeness of the fossil record, or the lack thereof, has remained a centerpiece in the debate over origins. what were Darwin's concerns, and where do we stand really 200 years later? Here's what Darwin said. The lack of transitional fossils, and I'll explain that in just a moment, really troubled him. He said, but as by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Good question. Now, here's what a transitional being, or maybe a fossil if it was dead and buried in mud, here's kind of what that means. It means that, in this case, they're saying, and they say a lot of crazy things, I can't explain all their craziness, but they say that a whale, or that rather, that a mammal here on the land became a whale by a step-by-step process. Okay? That a land animal, a land mammal, became a whale. That's where whales came from. You understand? They believe that. They believe that life came from the water, and then some of it went back to the water, and that's where whales came from. Now, without going through all the rigmarole as far as why they believe that and how bogus it is, just understand that these in-between animals are called transitional forms. They're in-between forms. That as this animal, which is imaginary, of course, became a whale, that there would be many steps along the way as it slowly changed over millions of years to go from a land mammal to an aquatic mammal, which has like 2 hairs. So whale has like 3 hairs right around his on the top. But anyway, not very much of a mammal, but he is one. But here's the thing that they don't show in the drawings, okay? It's been estimated by a lot of people that to go from here to here would take 50,000 changes. What I'm saying is there wouldn't be 2 of these, as is shown here. There would be 50,000. Now, that's a lot, folks. So for every one transformation from here to here, you would have 50,000 in-between animals that are becoming a whale. Does that make sense? Now, so here's the question. Why then are there not countless millions of them that were buried in the mud and became fossils? Amen. The truth is that as this became a whale, and it didn't, but if it had of, these kind of creatures would be most of what we find, by far, because the ratio would be at least 25,000 to 1. It would be 50,000 to 1 change, but 25,000 on each side of this animal, so to speak. So, but they don't have any verifiable transitional forms. 0. Now, that's a problem. It's a fatal flaw. Now, it's so bad for them that they have decided that all those fossils somehow, and this is legitimate, what they legitimately say, I've read it in many, many different sources, that these fossils somehow disappeared. That the layers that they were in amazingly vanished. That reminds me of what Jim Bakker said when the $50,000 vanished. He said, the devil got the money out of my computer. Well, I think the devil did. His name was Jim Bakker. So here's the alleged evolution of a horse, for example. You've seen this in textbooks. And so you would say between here and here would be thousands, up to 50,000 different changes. Here is what is called the geologic column, which shows simple life forms here. And this happened, way back. And as time, now here's today. So the further down you go, the further back in time you go is what they tell you. And you had simple, then more complex, more complex, more complex, more complex, and finally us at the top. Now, but in the real world, we don't see it like that. And in fact, the only place that the geologic column exists, as pictured here, is in a book or on the internet. Ask somebody who believes in this to show you a picture of it. They're always drawings. You know why? Because no picture exists, even of 2 layers, even of 1 layer, for that matter, that shows any kind of a change. Now, first of all, we understand from former lectures that these layers formed quickly, or else these animals would have rotted, and there would be erosion lines between the layers. But they're nice, neat lines because they happen quickly. You know, you can get an aquarium filled up with dirt from your backyard, shake it up real good, and it'll settle in layers. It'll happen quick. I'm going to skip this. No? Yeah, okay. Now, I've already mentioned this, but here's the statements about the 50,000 transitional forms. In other words, get again what I'm saying. I say, well, even if it was 10,000 transitional forms, because the 50,000 is an estimate, but even if it was 10,000, that would mean you'd find 10,000 in-betweens for every one that wasn't in between. And here's the big question is, where are they now? If evolution is still occurring as they suggest, we should be able to look around and see some more of them living right now, right? Because if they're still changing, then they ought to be running around loose everywhere by the tens of millions of them. But we don't, nobody, no scientist lifts up some little furry animal and says, see there, a fox is becoming something else. No, you know why? Because they know it's not true. Now, here's something else. Or here's a guy, now sadly he's in hell. Jay Gould, a very well-known atheist, and he said this: the extreme rarity, as in none, of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. In other words, your fossil hunters, your paleontologists, I ain't gonna tell you this, but it's an inside joke. There ain't no such thing as a transitional fossil. What are we gonna do about that? Here's a guy, he wrote this book specifically to rebuke what he considered the false claims of creationists about transitional fossils and other things. And after he wrote the book, and by the way, he was the head of the British Museum of Natural History. No lightweight guy as far as their opinion of him would be, Colin Patterson. And this book is still in print, I believe. You could probably still buy one. But the one fellow who read his book, who's a creationist scientist, said, hey, how come you don't have any pictures of any transitional forms? You got this big book all about it. I don't see any pictures of any. Where are your pictures of transitional fossils? I mean, if you're going to write a book defending transitional fossils, it looks like you'd have at least one picture, right? You don't have any pictures. Here's how he answered. He said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Then he says, I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. Interesting that you write a book about something you knew didn't exist. The heading says that there are things called living fossils. Well, now, what is a living fossil? Well, it is an animal or a plant that we see around us today, that there are fossils of them also in the sedimentary rock, in the limestone, in the shale. And when you look at the shale that they say is 20, 30, 300 million years old, and you look at the animal today, they look the same. And so the question is, well, now wait a minute. If evolution happened over the last several hundred million years, and you have this jaybird over here who's in a rock, he got made into a fossil, and I'm looking at the jaybird in my backyard, if evolution happened, how come he looks the same as when you say he's 300 million years old when he died? So there's lots of animals like that, you see. For example, and here's our friend Jay Gould again. He says the maintenance of stability within species must be considered as a major evolutionary problem. I'll say it is. What he's saying is that if you look at fossils from umpteen million years ago as they would define it, certainly it's not the case, and you look at that same animal today, the ones that are not extinct, they are identical. No change has occurred. Now, in other words, the fact that living things have not changed over millions of years is hard on the theory of evolution. I mean, this is a fact, not just an idea. If you have a fossil of a walnut leaf, and you look at a modern walnut tree, and the leaves on it, they are absolutely identical. They have not changed one bit. And yet, the evolutionists would say, well, that walnut leaf in that fossil rock is 300 million years old. Really? And evolution has occurred during the 300 million years. So why is a walnut tree the same? They know it's true. Now, here's one that is said to be, was for a long time believed to be extinct. It is a coelacanth. Here's a fossil. It is a remake. It's not a real fossil, but it's a reproduction of one. And for many, many, many decades, they said, well, there you go. That was a transitional form between an amphibian and a fish. There it is. There's proof. But wait a minute. They found them swimming around off the coast of Madagascar in 1935. And there are lots of them alive today. There have been several different groups of them found, and there's thousands of them in the ocean. So number one, they're not extinct, and number two, they're just a fish. They're not a transitional form in any shape, form, or fashion. So this fish that they say this fossil was, 65 million years ago, but this fossil and this fish are the same. They didn't change. That kind of implies there's been no evolution. Here is an interesting find here found in just a few years ago. I think maybe 20 years ago. This is amber, which is like pine tar, kind of thing, and it hardens. And there are all kind of cool things they find in amber. They found ancient atmosphere in amber, and it has more oxygen and so forth than we have today. But here is a salamander that was fossilized in amber. And they say this amber is 20 to 30 million years old. Now, here is a modern salamander. Now, this picture is not very good, so I'll show you this. This is a drawing that they made of the salamander in the amber. And boy, you can tell a lot of difference, can't you? I mean, 20, 30 million years, it changed a lot, didn't it? I didn't change at all. The salamander is still a salamander. By the way, if it was an elephant, I might say, okay, I'll think about that. But either way, it's still a salamander, right? Here's a wasp in a rock they said is millions and millions of years old. Here's the same wasp. It's your house. They're the same. They look the same. They did not evolve. Here's a starfish. Ancient starfish, countless millions of years old, they say. Here's a modern starfish. Still a starfish, number one, and they look the same, number two. Why? Because no evolution occurred. None, zero, nada, no evolution occurred. So the next challenge is by the lack of scientific breakthroughs and discoveries due to evolution. And the question is evolution actually part of science? Is it really part of science? Now, just because something's in a science book doesn't mean it's really science, okay? So now the question is this: what modern breakthroughs in the medical field, for example, or in the world of any kind of science, what do we know that we wouldn't know were it not for evolution? And what's been discovered, which would not have been discovered were it not for evolution? We call it science falsely so-called. Now, before I answer the question, here is the website of the National Academy of Sciences. They have a division called the National Research Council, and they are supposed to be really smart, and they made these standards for what science is, okay? Because that's a hard question, they say. So here's what they decided: that for something to be science, there has to be observational data. There have to be accurate predictions, and what that means is that if this is true here, then we would expect this over here to be true. For example, if Noah's flood is true, we would expect to have the world covered with sedimentary rock. And it is, almost all of it, 2/3 of it. It would have to be logical. It could not defy logic. that life, for example, that life spontaneously arose from non-life. That's not logical. It would have to be open to criticism, which is not so much the case. If you're one of these scientists and you don't believe in evolution, buddy, you're on the blacklist. The information has to be accurate and no presuppositions. Well, all of evolutionary thought is based on presuppositions. So at every point, evolution fails to meet their own definition of what science is. Karl Popper, famous philosopher, said Darwinism is not a testable scientific theory, but a metaphysical, religious research program. Michael Ruse, evolutionary scientist and philosopher, said evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution in the beginning, and it is true of evolution still today. It is the religion of humanism, atheism, and agnosticism. Now, science involves experimenting to figure out how things work, how they operate. Why then is evolution a theory about history taught as if it were the same as operational science like chemistry or physics? You can do a chemistry experiment, can't you? You can do a physics experiment. You can't do an evolution experiment. It's not repeatable. It's not observable. Ask if evolution had been observed. Richard Dawkins said this: evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. Okay, Ricky. He says you can't even begin to understand biology. I bet Lauren Powers understands it. You can't understand life unless you understand what it's all there for. Well, if he's right, it wouldn't be there for anything, would it? Random chemicals aren't there for, they're just there, they're not there for any purpose. There's no reason for it. They're random, just like your thoughts, they say, are random. You're not really having them. It's just a reaction of chemicals inside your head. He says how it arose, and that means evolution. In other words, he's saying without believing in evolution, you can't understand science. You can't understand biology. Now, here is a list of the most 10 important scientific breakthroughs and discoveries which would not exist were it not for evolution. Here they are. Would someone read them for me? Now, without these 10 discoveries, our life would not be as it is. Evolution is all important. Because evolution, we know these 10 things. Well, they're not there, are they? Okay, so where are the scientific breakthroughs due to evolution? This honest man, Dr. Mark Kirschner, chair of the Department of Systems Biology at the little, backwoods college called Harvard Medical School, which you've probably never heard of, he says, in fact, over the last 100 years, almost all of biology has proceeded independent of evolution, except evolutionary biology itself. In other words, they're studying something, and their study of evolution, as they call it, is the only thing that they've been involved in. There's no discoveries because of it. He says molecular biology, biochemistry, physiology have not taken evolution into account at all. It is of no value to practical science, zero. It's also challenged by, oh my goodness, it's too late. I'll pick up here next time. It is challenged by the complexity of what is called simple life. Did you know there's no such thing as simple life? And we'll talk about that next time, Lord willing. Let's all stand. And let's pray together, and we'll see you, Lord willing, next time we meet, okay? All right, Jonathan Paris, would you please dismiss us?